Haemophila, or tuberculosis of the lymph nodes, was for a long time in England and France known as the King's Evil and was cured by a touch from the monarch. But this wasn't the only thing that the monarchs could allegedly cure. For instance, starting with Edward the Confessor, monarchs used to bless rings around Good Friday, and these rings could cure things like cramp and epilepsy. But touching people with the King's Evil was a lot more prevalent in France and England at least, and this royal touch was performed by some monarchs like Edward I over 1,000 times a year. However, some Protestant leaders like Edward VI refused to take part in the practice, believing it to be too Catholic. But starting around Elizabeth's reign, monarchs had to prove their legitimacy as a ruler by performing this royal touch. After all, this was the time when the divine rights of king was the dominant theory, and this was one way to prove, this miracle was one way to prove that they'd been selected by God. So, during the French Wars of Religion, for instance, Henry III had to contend with a lot of propaganda started by the Catholic League that said he could not cure people. So, back in England, Charles II, whose father had his head cut off after the English Civil War, proved his legitimacy as the ruler by touching over 4,000 people a year. But shortly after he died, people began to question whether or not the royals actually healed anybody at all. Now, the last monarch to ever perform the royal touch was Anne in the early 18th century, and one of the last people to ever receive the royal touch was a 2-year-old boy, and this 2-year-old boy was Samuel Johnson, the man who went to go write the dictionary. But after receiving the royal touch, he still had the King's Evil, so had to go for an operation anyway.